There are transactions in this world that make no sense until they do. A piece of property sold for $1 is not a sale. It is a confession. It is a woman who cannot bring herself to burn something down and cannot bear to keep it standing. It is a door to a room she stopped being able to enter, passed to someone else's hands before the weight of it finished her off. Ethan Graves was 46 years old when he drove up that mountain road in eastern Tennessee with everything he owned, loaded in the bed of his truck, and a German shepherd named Argos riding shotgun. He had a veteran's discharge papers in his glove box, 2 Purple Hearts he kept in a coffee tin, and a bank account that could survive maybe 4 months before it went quiet. He had a jaw that looked like it had been cut from creek limestone and eyes the color of gunmetal, and he had not slept a full night in 3 years. The war had given him things he never asked for and taken things he never got back. He did not talk about the specific inventory of either. Men like Ethan kept those ledgers private. What he had was Argos. The shepherd was 85 pounds of coal black and deep amber fur, with ears that tracked sound the way a satellite dish tracks signal, and a pair of pale gold eyes that seemed to understand everything Ethan said before he finished saying it. They had been together 9 years. Argos had been with him through the last deployment, and through the divorce, and through the year after the divorce when Ethan lived in a rented room above a laundromat in Knoxville and stared at the ceiling most nights. The dog did not ask questions. He simply stayed. That was the thing about Argos. He simply stayed. The listing had appeared in a printed circular. Ethan picked up at a gas station near Cookeville. Not online. Printed on paper, the kind of font you see on hardware store flyers. Single paragraph, remote cabin on 4 acres, Cumber County, Eastern Ridge, priced at $1. Contact Eleanor Marsh. He had stood in the parking lot of that gas station for a long time, reading that one paragraph 3 times. Then he called the number. Eleanor Marsh had a voice like river, gravel, and autumn wind. She answered on the second ring, which told him she had been waiting for someone to call. She asked him 2 questions before he could ask her anything. She asked if he was from around here originally. He said no, North Carolina. 20 years gone. She asked if he had served. He said yes, Army. 2 tours in Kandahar. There was a pause that felt longer than it was. She said Robert had been a veteran himself. Navy. 22 years. She said she could not live there anymore, but she could not sell it to just anyone. She said she had a feeling about him. Eleanor Marsh was 63 years old and wore her white hair pinned back with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from decades of hard choices made without complaint. She was waiting on the porch when he pulled up, and she watched Argos climb down from the passenger side before she watched Ethan, and something in her face settled when she saw the dog. Not relief. Exactly. Something older than relief. Recognition. They walked the property for 40 minutes. 4 acres of mountain land, second-growth hardwood mostly, a spring-fed creek cutting the southeast corner. The cabin itself was hand-hewn log, a century old at least, with a stone chimney that would need repointing and a metal roof that had held up fine. 2 rooms downstairs, a sleeping loft, a covered porch. A woodshed around back stacked with split oak that Robert had put up himself. The stack was covered and tight, the way a man cuts wood who expects to burn it himself, not leave it for someone else. Eleanor did not go inside. She stood at the door and pointed things out, but she did not cross the threshold. Ethan noticed that. He noticed she kept one hand on the door frame. The whole time she talked about the kitchen, like she needed the wood to stay steady. Robert had died 14 months prior. Heart attack, she said. He had been out there working the property in the fall. He'd always said he wanted to go that way. Out here, working. She said it without bitterness, but also without comfort. Just the plain fact of it, stated by a woman who had already run it through her mind 10,000 times and reached no cleaner understanding. Ethan asked why $1. She said because the cabin wasn't hers to profit from. She said Robert would have wanted it to go to someone who needed it, not someone who was just collecting acreage. She said she'd had 2 other calls, a developer from Chattanooga and a man who wanted to use it as a hunting camp. And she'd said no to both. She said she trusted her instincts about people. And the instinct she had about Ethan was that he needed ground under him more than he needed walls around him. He signed the paperwork at her kitchen table, 12 miles down the mountain. $1 bill, both their signatures. She folded her copy and put it in a cedar box, without looking at it. At the door, she stopped him once. She reached out and put her hand on Argos's broad head and held it there for a moment, with her eyes closed. Then she looked at Ethan. She said there was a bookshelf on the north wall of the main room. She said to pay attention to it. She didn't explain what she meant by that. She just said pay attention to it. Then she stepped back inside and let the door close. He drove back up the mountain thinking about that for the last 6 miles of Switchback Road. That first night he lit a fire and listened to the mountain. Argos settled near the hearth and tracked the sounds outside with his ears, while his body stayed still. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and old pine and something else Ethan couldn't name at first, a particular kind of quiet. That has weight to it, the kind that accumulates in a place where good work was done over a long time. He had been in enough desolate spaces to know the difference. Desolation had its own smell. This wasn't it. He ate cold food from a can and looked around the room. There wasn't much to look at. A wood stove. A pine table worn smooth by years of elbows. 2 ladder-backed chairs. A cast-iron skillet hanging on a peg. And on the north wall, the bookshelf. It was built into the wall itself, floor to ceiling, heavy timber shelves holding maybe 200 volumes. Older books mostly. History, military history. A complete run of Louis L'Amour paperbacks with cracked spines. A Bible with a name written inside the front cover that he didn't look at yet. Tucked between 2 volumes of American military campaigns was a handwritten notebook with a leather cover. He pulled it out and opened it. Robert Marsh's handwriting. Patient, upright letters, dates going back 20 years. He put it back. That wasn't his to read tonight. He was running his hand along the lowest shelf when Argos came off the hearth. The shepherd crossed the room in 4 quiet strides and put his nose to the baseboard below the shelf. Not the casual investigation of a curious dog, the focused work of an animal that has found something. He pressed his nose along the join where the shelf met the wall, slow and deliberate, moving from one end to the other. Then he sat down and looked at Ethan. Ethan crouched beside him. He pressed his palm flat to the wall and felt it. The bookshelf did not sit flush against the log. There was a gap. Not a construction gap, a deliberate gap. He stood and looked at the shelf from the side. It was on hinges. A piano hinge, the full height of the frame, hidden behind the trim board. He looked for a latch and found it near the floor. A flush bolt set into the bottom shelf rail. He slid it. Steel framed, set into the log wall, painted the same color as the chinking, so it disappeared when the shelf was closed. There was a combination lock in the handle. He stared at it for a long time. Argos sat beside him and stared at it too. Pay attention to it, that was all Eleanor had said. Not what was behind it, not whether she knew the combination. Just pay attention to it. He did not force it that night. A man who has served knows that some doors open in their own time, and forcing them before then tends to end badly. He swung the shelf back, shot the bolt, and went up to the sleeping loft with Argos, and lay there, listening to the mountain until it got dark enough that even listening became sleep. He drove down to Eleanor's house the next morning. The drive down took 20 minutes on a road that demanded attention. Switchbacks cut into the ridge at angles that required full commitment at every turn. In the dark, those curves were something else entirely. In daylight, they were merely demanding. Ethan had driven worse roads, in worse conditions, in places where a wrong turn meant more than a bent axle, so he was comfortable enough. He used the time to think. He thought about what a door like that meant. A man who builds a hidden room inside a hidden door does not do it for storage. People who want extra storage buy shelving units. They do not frame steel doors into log walls and hide them behind bookshelves. A room like that is built to hold something specific, something the builder considered worth protecting from specific kinds of people. There is a difference between privacy and concealment, and Robert Marsh had chosen concealment for a reason. The second thing he thought about was Eleanor's phrasing. She had not said check on the bookshelf or look behind the bookshelf. She had said pay attention to it. That was a woman who knew the room existed, but had made a deliberate choice not to tell him directly. She could have handed him the combination at the kitchen table. She had not. She had given him a direction and trusted him to find his way there. That was not avoidance. That was a test of a particular kind. The kind that tells you something about whether a person will take what they find and run with it, or take what they find and do right by it. She was in the kitchen garden when he came up the drive, pulling winter squash. She looked at him coming, and her face did something complicated. She set down what she was holding and wiped her hands on her apron. He told her about the door. He told her Argos had found it inside of 4 hours. She listened with her hands folded and her eyes steady. She went quiet for a moment. Then she told him about Robert. Robert Marsh had spent 22 years in the United States Navy and come home a man who understood something about what the country asked of its young people and what it failed to give back to them when they were done. He had watched men come home and fall through the cracks of a system that thanked them in speeches and forgot them in practice. He had seen the isolation, the untreated wounds, the quiet disappearances of men who could survive combat zones but couldn't survive a Tuesday morning alone in a small apartment with no mission and no brothers and no reason to get up. So, Robert had built one, not through any organization, not with government grants or nonprofit structure or official letterhead. Robert had built it the old way, quietly, over 20 years, using the cabin as a base and the mountain as the thing that gave broken men a reason to get up and use their hands. He had taken in veterans, 1 or 2 at a time, men who had nowhere steady to land, men who needed work and space and the company of someone who did not ask them to explain themselves. He put them to work on the property, running fence, working the land. He paid them from his own retirement income, modest amounts, but enough to let a man feel he was earning rather than receiving. And over those 20 years, he had accumulated something, but the quiet savings of a man who lived simply and gave carefully, and knew that what he was doing would need to continue after him. He had been putting money aside for 30 years. Set back in that room behind the bookshelf was the documentation of everything he'd done, every man he'd helped, the records kept with the precision of a Navy officer, and what remained of the fund he'd built to keep it going. Eleanor had not told anyone about it, not her sons, who lived in Atlanta and Charlotte and called on birthdays, not the pastor, not even her closest neighbor. Because 6 weeks after Robert died, his brother Clifton had shown up at her door. Clifton Marsh was 60 years old and had the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He and Robert had not been close in 30 years. A falling out over money back when their parents died. The kind of fracture that calcifies over time, until the two men existed in separate orbits, their only contact an occasional obligatory call at Christmas. Eleanor had met him 3 times. She had not liked him any of those 3 times. Clifton had heard, through family murmur, that Robert had been sitting on something. He didn't know specifics, but he knew Robert had lived frugally and saved seriously, and he had a feeling, the way people with hungry eyes always have feelings about other people's things. He had asked Eleanor about Robert's accounts. She had told him what was publicly known, the Navy pension, the savings account. He had pushed, she had not pushed back. She had simply become still and quiet, the way the mountain became still before weather, and Clifton had read that and left. Clifton had come back twice more after that first visit. The second time he brought a woman Eleanor didn't recognize, introduced as his accountant, who had sat in Eleanor's kitchen and asked questions about property values and probate procedures with the systematic efficiency of someone paid to extract information. Eleanor had answered the questions that were answerable in the public record and said nothing about anything else. The accountant had written things down in a small notebook. When they left, Eleanor stood at the window and watched the car until it was gone. The third visit, Clifton had come alone. He had been warmer that time, more careful, the smile deployed more frequently. He talked about Robert, about their boyhood, about how sad it was that they drifted apart, about how Robert would have wanted the family to be whole in his absence. Eleanor had listened to all of it and served coffee and said very little, and when he asked again about assets, she told him again that what she knew about was public record, and that probate would handle the rest. When he had left, without the warmth he'd arrived with. 6 months after that first visit, his attorney had sent a letter. He was challenging the will. Procedural grounds at first, then escalating to a claim that Robert had lacked capacity in his final years. Eleanor knew it was nonsense. She also knew that nonsense dressed in legal clothing cost money to fight. When Ethan heard all of this, he was sitting at Eleanor's kitchen table, with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her the combination. She wrote it on a piece of paper and slid it across the table. The room behind the bookshelf was 8 feet by 12. Robert had built it himself into the back slope of the foundation. Reinforced walls, a dehumidifier on a timer, a single overhead light on a pull chain. It was clean and dry and organized with military precision. Steel shelving units along 2 walls. Filing boxes labeled by year. A lockbox bolted to the back wall. A corkboard with photographs pinned to it. Ethan stood in the doorway for a minute with the pull chain in his hand and just looked at it. Argos had followed him in and was making his way along the shelves, nose working in that same patient, systematic way. He did everything. The shepherd was not alarmed by the room. He moved through it with a kind of ease, the way a dog moves through a space that holds old calm rather than old danger. Ethan started with the filing boxes. He spent most of that afternoon in there. The records were extraordinary. 23 men over 20 years. Their names recorded in Robert's careful handwriting alongside dates and notes, brief sketches of where each man had come from, and what he'd come looking for, and what he'd left with. Some had stayed a few weeks, a few had stayed months. One had worked the property through 2 full winters, before he was steady enough to go back out into the world. None of them were asked to pay for what they received. The only requirement Robert had written at the front of the first ledger was a single line: "You leave this place stronger than you came." That is the only debt. The first box he opened covered the years from 1994 through 2001. 7 names. Each one had a small card in Robert's hand with a date of arrival, a date of departure, the man's branch of service, and a single line describing what he came with and what he left with. Not financially. One card said, "Arrived, closed, departed, open enough." Another said, "Arrived, couldn't sleep, departed, sleeping sometimes." One card from 2001 said, "Arrived, didn't know why he was still here, departed." That was all. No name on that one. Robert had left the name blank and just marked the dates. Ethan sat on the floor of that room and read those cards for a long time. He thought about what it cost to write a thing like that down. Not the skill of the writing, the honesty of the observation. To sit across from a man who doesn't know why he's still here then, a month later. Write departed. Found one reason. You have to have been in that room enough yourself to understand what you're watching. You have to know what the before looks like and be paying close enough attention to recognize the after. He put the box back and opened the next one. The lockbox held 4 items. A sealed letter addressed to Eleanor, written in Robert's hand. A smaller envelope addressed in different handwriting, sealed with no name on it. A USB drive taped to a folded note that said "legal documentation," and a handwritten ledger of a different kind from the filing records. This one financial, 30 years of careful contributions to a single purpose, the running total climbing the right margin in clean numerals. Ethan did not open the letter or the envelope. Those were not his to open. He picked up the USB drive and held it and thought about Clifton Marsh and his attorney's letters and the particular legal move Eleanor had described. The petition to void the sale, filed 3 weeks ago, arguing that Eleanor had sold property that was part of the disputed estate, and that the $1 transaction was invalid pending resolution of the will challenge. The clock had been ticking before Ethan ever drove up that mountain road. He just hadn't known it. He drove back down that afternoon. He sat with Eleanor at her kitchen table again, and he put the ledger and the USB drive in front of her, and he told her what he'd found. She listened with her hands folded, the way she always did. When he was done, she reached across and touched the sealed letter with one fingertip, just touched it, without picking it up. She said she had known Robert kept records. She had not known the extent of it. She had not known about the fund or the USB drive. She had thought the room held papers and memory. She had not been inside it since the week after Robert died, and she had only been in once while he was alive, to bring him coffee when he was working in there late. And she had not looked at anything closely. It had felt private even then, the way a man's real work always feels private to the people who love him. Ethan asked her who her attorney was. She did not have one. She had been handling Clifton's legal claims herself, which was exactly what Clifton's attorney had been counting on. Ethan drove to Cumber County the following morning and sat down with a lawyer named Dwight Ferris, who had the reputation of being the most tenacious property attorney in 3 counties, and who also happened to have lost a son in Iraq in 2007. When Ethan explained the situation, Dwight Ferris turned the USB drive over in his hand and asked one question. He asked if the documentation on there was in Robert Marsh's handwriting and dated. Ethan told him there were 30 years of dates in Robert's hand, a notarized statement of intent from 2 years prior, and 3 witnesses whose names appeared on multiple documents going back a decade. Dwight Farris set the USB drive on his desk and said Clifton Marsh was going to have a problem. He said it the way a man says something he is confident about. No heat in it, no performance. He said the notarized statement of intent alone was going to be a significant obstacle for Clifton's team. He said that when you add 30 years of documented record-keeping in the deceased's own hand, witnessed and cross-referenced, to a notarized statement of intent, to 3 surviving witnesses who could speak to Robert's mental clarity and purpose right up until his death, you have a body of evidence that tells a coherent and well-documented story. He said courts like coherent, well-documented stories. He said they especially like them when the opposing argument is a man with hungry eyes and a motivated attorney who took the case on contingency. Ethan asked about the dollar sale specifically. Dwight said the dollar sale was actually the cleaner issue. He said the law on nominal consideration sales was clear. The question was whether Eleanor had the authority to make the sale. And, since the will challenge had to be resolved first, they were working in the right order. He said he'd file to dismiss the will challenge first, and if that succeeded, the sale petition would lose its foundation. He picked up the USB drive and turned it over again. He said one more thing. He said he wasn't going to charge his normal rate for this one. He said his son had come home from Ramadi in 2005 and had needed something exactly like what Robert Marsh had built and had not found it. And that had been one of the things that made the end of his son's story go the way it went in 2007. He said the least he could do for Robert Marsh's legacy was make sure Clifton didn't get his hands on it. Ethan drove back up the mountain that evening and did not say anything about the conversation to anyone. He went to the woodshed and split oak until his shoulders were done, before going inside to feed the fire and sit with Argos until the weight of everything settled into something manageable. The clock was ticking. But the clock was ticking in their favor. It did not resolve quickly. Nothing that runs through courtrooms ever does. But it moved with a kind of steady, accumulating momentum that reminded Ethan of the way Argos worked a scent trail, patient and unhurried, and absolutely certain of where it was going. Dwight filed a motion to dismiss the will challenge. He filed a separate motion, opposing the petition to void the sale. He obtained a temporary injunction protecting the cabin and the property while the challenges worked through the docket. Clifton's attorney pushed back hard, the way attorneys push back when they can feel the ground moving. He tried 3 different procedural angles. Dwight closed each one. Meanwhile, Ethan was on the mountain. He had made a decision the night he came back from Eleanor's with the combination in his pocket. He had made it somewhere between the base of the mountain and the cabin on that 6 miles of switchback road with Argos riding shotgun and the trees going dark on both sides. He had not announced this decision to anyone. He simply started working. He started with the woodshed. He split and stacked what remained of last year's fallen timber and began bringing in new. Then the fence line, which had sagged in 2 places along the upper pasture. Then the porch boards, 3 of them soft with weather, pulled and replaced with new white oak planks cut from a tree that had come down in a storm. He worked from first light until the light ran out. He made simple food, ate it at the worn pine table, and slept the sleep of a man whose body has been given something legitimate to spend its energy on. He had not slept through a night since Kandahar. He started sleeping through the night the 3rd week on the mountain. Argos stayed at his hip through all of it. The shepherd had always been a working dog at heart, and on this land he found his element. He patrolled the fence line each morning with the systematic attention of a dog who understands that the perimeter matters. He flushed grouse from the lower meadow. He tracked deer trails in the evenings with his nose low and his tail raised, cataloging the mountain in the way dogs catalog the world, through smell and memory and the particular satisfaction of knowing a place thoroughly. There was one afternoon when Ethan was repointing the chimney, and Argos sat below him on the roof and watched the ridge for 2 hours without being asked. Ethan was not in danger, but Argos watched the ridge anyway. Some things you teach a dog, some things a dog simply knows. Eleanor came up the mountain 3 weeks after Ethan moved in. He had not invited her and had not expected her. She pulled up in a blue Ford pickup that was older than most of the trees she'd driven through to get there, and she got out and stood in the yard and looked at the cabin. He had done more in 3 weeks than she had expected. The porch was straight. The yard was clear of the brush that had been creeping up the south side. The stone path from the gate to the steps had been reset and leveled. The place looked like it was being lived in, which was different from looking like it was being maintained. There is a quality a house takes on when someone is truly living in it, a settled quality, a sense that the structure and the person inside it have reached an agreement. Eleanor stood in the yard and looked at it for a long time. She did not say anything, but her shoulders did something. They came down from where she'd been carrying them. Ethan put coffee on and they sat on the porch. Argos lay between their chairs, with his head on his paws, and the mountain went about its business in the middle distance. It was late October. The trees on the far ridge were going gold and rust, and the air had the particular sharpness that comes to high ground in fall, that smell of cold stone and decaying leaves, and something sweet underneath that you cannot quite name. Eleanor told him about Robert Moore that afternoon. Not the operational details she'd shared before, the veterans he'd helped, the records, the money. She told him about the man, how he had woken every morning before light and sat with coffee on this same porch and simply looked at the mountain until the light came. How he had been quiet in the way that strong men are quiet, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had learned the difference between words that add weight to a thing and words that only add noise. How he had always kept a book going, but could go weeks without opening it, because the land provided its own reading. She talked about Robert the way people talk about someone they have been missing for so long, that the missing has become part of their daily architecture, not a wound anymore, but a room in the house of themselves they carry everywhere. Ethan listened. He did not try to fill the pauses. Men who have been through what Ethan had been through learn eventually that some silences are not empty. They are full of things that cannot be translated into language, and the respectful thing is to let them be full. As the light started to go, she told him she had been coming up here in her mind every day since Robert died, walking the property in her head, sitting on this porch, watching the ridge. She had not been able to make her feet do what her mind kept doing. She had not been able to come back until today, and she still wasn't entirely sure how she'd made it up the road. She thought maybe the difference was knowing someone was here, knowing the place was alive again. Ethan didn't respond to that directly. He refilled her coffee and told her the ridge had been putting on a show at dawn. She came back 2 weeks later, then again the week after that. She brought a ham the third time, and they cooked it on the wood stove and ate at the pine table where Robert had eaten 10,000 meals. She started pointing things out as they walked the property, where Robert had meant to plant an orchard, the natural drainage channel he'd been planning to improve, the lower field that had gone to scrub but could be cleared back. She was not cataloging damage. She was describing a vision that had not died with the man who'd had it. She was walking Ethan through a future. He paid attention. In late November, the first papers came from Dwight's office that mattered. The will challenge had been dismissed. The judge had found no credible basis for the capacity claim and had noted with some pointed language that the challenge appeared to have been filed for purposes of harassment rather than legitimate dispute. The petition to void the sale was still pending, but Dwight was confident. He said the documentation in that room was the kind of evidence that made opposing attorneys go quiet. Ethan drove to Eleanor's to deliver the news personally. She read the dismissal order at her kitchen table with her reading glasses on and her face composed before setting it down, and sat with her hands flat on the table for a moment. She said Robert had always said Clifton would try something. She said Robert had prepared for it. She said Robert had known himself well enough to know he was going to die before her, and he had spent the last 5 years of his life making sure that when he was gone, what he built wouldn't die with him. She looked up at Ethan. She asked him if he understood what Robert had built. He told her he'd spent a lot of time in that room with those records. He said he understood it about as well as a person can understand 20 years of quiet work done by someone they never met. She nodded slowly. Then she asked him if he'd thought about what would happen to it now. He had thought about almost nothing else. The first man arrived in December. His name was Luis Vasquez, 38 years old, Marine Corps, 2 deployments. He'd heard through the kind of informal network that exists among veterans in the way rivers exist in mountain country, mostly underground, emerging in unexpected places, that there was land up in Cumber County where a man could work for a while if he needed to work. He drove up in a truck that sounded like it was running on hope, and he had a duffel bag with 3 changes of clothes and the specific look in his eyes of a man who is not afraid of hard work but has run out of reasons to do it. Ethan showed him the woodshed and the fence line and told him what needed doing. He set Luis up in the sleeping loft. He cooked dinner that first night, and they ate at the pine table without much talking, and Argos lay near the wood stove and the mountain went about its business outside. They worked through December in the cold and the short light. The mountain in December was a different thing from the mountain in October. It demanded a different relationship. The warmth was gone out of the air, and the trees had shed down to their bones, and the sky pressed lower, and the days ended at 4 in the afternoon in a kind of iron dark that left you with either too much time to think or just enough time to be grateful you were tired enough to sleep. Luis worked like a man who had been given back a purpose he'd thought he'd lost. He didn't talk much in the first week. He cut wood with a methodical intensity and fixed fence posts with the same. Ethan gave him space and watched without appearing to watch, the way a good NCO watches a man he's trying to read. By the second week, Luis was talking at dinner. Not about anything significant at first. The truck, the road, the deer he'd seen at the creek, the gradual forward movement of a man who has been quiet so long. He's forgotten what it's like to use his own voice in the presence of another person. By the third week, Luis had started asking about Robert. Ethan told him what he knew. He told it plainly, without embellishment, the way it deserved to be told. A man who had served, who had come home and looked around at what was happening to his brothers and had decided to do something about it with whatever he had, which turned out to be land and time and the discipline of a Navy officer applied to the problem of human beings who needed to be useful. Luis listened to that. He was quiet for a while. He said he wished he'd known about this place 2 years ago. Ethan said he understood that. They ate in the quiet that followed, the fire in the wood stove working away. Argos stretched full length on the floor between their chairs, the mountain doing what mountains do outside the walls. Luis was there when the second dismissal came through in January. The petition to void the sale had been denied. The judge had reviewed Robert's documentation, the notarized statement of intent, the 30 years of records, the 3 witnesses Dwight had located and deposed, and had found that the sale was valid, that Eleanor had full authority to sell, and that the property belonged to Ethan Graves free and clear. Clifton Marsh filed the notice of appeal the same week. Dwight said to let him file. He said the appellate court was going to look at the same body of evidence the lower court had reviewed and reach the same conclusion, and that the only thing Clifton's appeal was going to accomplish was costing Clifton another $15,000 in legal fees he would not recover. He was right about the timeline, he was right about the cost, and he was right about the outcome. The appeal was reviewed and denied inside of 6 weeks, a speed that suggested the appellate panel had not found it a close question. The written denial was 2 pages, 1 paragraph of procedural summary, 1 paragraph of findings, 1 sentence at the end that Dwight read aloud to Ethan over the phone, and that Ethan wrote down on a piece of paper and put in his shirt pocket. The sentence said, "The record reflects a clear and consistent expression of the decedent's intent, thoroughly documented over multiple decades, and the court finds no basis to disturb the disposition made in accordance with that intent." Ethan read that sentence to Eleanor the same afternoon, sitting on her porch with the coffee between them and Argos on the steps. She listened to it with her eyes closed. Then she said, "That's Robert, all right." Ethan folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. Dwight said to let him file. He said the appeal had no more legs than the original petition, and that the documentation made the case airtight. He said Clifton was spending money to feel like he was doing something, and that eventually he would stop when the balance in his account gave out. He was right about that. The appeal was denied 4 months later. By then, there were 2 more men on the mountain, a former Army engineer named Thomas, who could fix anything with an engine, a Navy corpsman named Garrett, who had come home from the Gulf with his body intact and something else not quite intact, and who needed, more than anything, the company of people who did not require him to be fine. Ethan put them both to work. The fence was fully repaired, the orchard plot Robert had dreamed about had been cleared and turned, and the lower field had been reclaimed from the scrub brush that had been creeping across it for a year and a half. Eleanor came up every week now. Sometimes she brought food, sometimes she brought nothing, and just walked the land with Ethan and Argos while the men worked. She would stop and watch the work with an expression that Ethan had learned to read, a particular combination of grief and satisfaction that the land was alive again, that it was doing what it had been built to do. There was an afternoon in late spring when they were standing at the edge of the upper pasture, watching Thomas and Luis working the fence line below them, and Garrett was splitting wood near the shed with the particular focused intensity of a man who has found out that physical work is the thing that quiets the noise. The mountain was all green and birdsong and the smell of warming stone. Argos was quartering the meadow in wide circles. For no reason anyone would understand except that meadows in spring need to be quartered. Eleanor said that Robert used to stand in this exact spot. Ethan said he'd figured as much. She said he used to say that the measure of a man wasn't what he built, but whether what he built outlasted him. Ethan looked out at the fence line and the orchard plot and the reclaimed field and the men working below them, who had come up the mountain empty and were not empty anymore. He said he thought Robert had done all right on that measure. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something he hadn't expected. She said she thought she'd sold the cabin to the wrong man the first time. She'd met Ethan's eyes when she said it, straight on, no evasion in it. She said she'd sold it to a man she thought needed ground under him, and that was true as far as it went. She said she hadn't understood until she started coming up here and watching what he did with it, that she'd actually sold it to a man who needed a mission. She said those were different things. He didn't answer right away. He watched Argos complete a long arc across the meadow, black and amber, moving through the high spring grass, those pale gold eyes sweeping forward. He said he reckoned they were. The summer brought more men and more work. The orchard took shape. 12 apple trees in rows. The soil turned and amended the way Thomas had learned in the Army Corps, somehow never forgotten, even when he forgot other things. Garrett had discovered a talent for woodworking that he hadn't known he had and had begun building furniture in the woodshed. Simple pieces, well made. A table, 2 benches, a chest for the sleeping loft. Thomas had rebuilt the tractor engine that Robert had been keeping alive by will and mechanical stubbornness alone. The mountain was producing again, and between the work and the evenings on the porch and the slow rhythm of the season, something else was taking shape. The kind of thing that doesn't announce itself, that builds the way a fire builds from a coal. Each addition so small, don't notice the accumulation until suddenly there is warmth everywhere. Ethan noticed it the evening Eleanor stayed late enough that driving the mountain road in the dark became a genuine concern, and he suggested she take the loft and he'd sleep downstairs. He noticed the ease with which he had accepted that, without awkwardness, the way it had felt less like a courtesy extended between near strangers and more like a natural arrangement between people who had already moved past the territory of near strangers without making a formal announcement of the fact. He noticed it when she started consulting him on the plan she was working up for expanding the program, because it had become, without either of them naming it, a program, now, something with structure and intent behind it. She had the relationships in the veteran community from Robert's, years, names, and contacts in the informal network. He had the land and the operational instinct. She talked about what it could be, and he listened, said what he thought. And she listened to that, and they went back and forth until a plan emerged that neither of them could have made alone. He noticed it the way you notice a change in the weather, not when it arrives, but sometime in the middle of it, when you realize the air is completely different from what it was an hour ago, and you're not sure exactly when it changed. One evening in late August, he was on the porch, watching the ridge go dark, and Eleanor was inside doing something in the kitchen, and Argos was beside him with his chin on the porch rail, ears tracking the last birds of the day. And Ethan thought about where he had been 12 months ago. The rented room above the laundromat. The ceiling he had stared at. The specific particular hollowness of a man who has used up his reason for being the way you use up a tank of gas, all the way to empty, coasting on whatever the gauge reads after the needle hits the pin. He thought about the dollar bill he'd handed Eleanor in her kitchen. He thought about her saying she trusted her instincts about people. There had been a moment in July that he kept returning to. They had been working on the orchard plot, marking the spacing for the trees, and Eleanor had been walking the rows he'd staked out with a measuring tape, checking the intervals. And at one point she'd stopped and looked up from the ground and across the plot to where he was standing, and she'd said nothing, just looked. And the thing that passed between them in that moment was not the kind of thing you could put language to, but it was clear enough that he'd had to look away first and go back to what he was doing, and he'd spent the rest of that afternoon being careful not to look up at the same moment she did. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had been in places where the ambient level of threat was something you could taste in the air, and he had not flinched. But this was a different category of thing. This was the particular unsteadiness of a man who has been carrying his life alone for long enough that the weight of it has become his normal, until someone walks alongside him for a while, and suddenly, the load feels different, and he doesn't entirely trust the difference yet, because the last time he trusted a difference like that, it had not held. He knew Eleanor's history. He knew she was 14 months out from burying a man she'd loved for 38 years. He knew grief of that depth does not resolve in 14 months. It reorganizes, it becomes something you carry differently, but it does not disappear. He was not going to be careless about that. But the ridge was doing what it did in late August going gold at the edges in the last hour of light, and the creak was audible from the porch, and Garrett was working in the shed with the particular rhythm of a chisel. And the mountain had the specific quality of a place where things were happening that were worth the effort it had taken to make them happen. And Ethan was sitting with all of that and the particular feeling of a man who has arrived somewhere without a plan for arriving. The door behind him opened, and Eleanor came out with 2 mugs. She set one beside him and stood at the rail and looked out at the ridge. Argos's tail moved once without the rest of him moving, which was his particular signal of contentment with the arrangement of things. She said the paperwork for the formal charter had come through from the state. They were official. He said he supposed that meant they had to start acting like it. She said she supposed it did. The ridge was nearly dark now, just a line of darker shape against the darkening sky, and the first stars were beginning. You could hear the creak from where they stood. You could hear one of the men in the woodshed, the rhythm of a chisel, Garrett working late the way he sometimes did, because the evenings were harder than the days. Ethan thought about Robert Marsh, who had stood on this same porch and looked at this same ridge and built something 20 years long from nothing but conviction and patience, and the understanding that some debts are not personal but are owed by one generation to another, by those who came through to those who were still trying to find their way through. He thought about the room behind the bookshelf, and Argos finding it in the dark on the first night, and Eleanor's hand on Argos's head when she said goodbye in her kitchen, and the combination written on a slip of paper slid across a table, 1 woman to 1 man, an act of trust offered on pure instinct. He said he thought Robert had known someone would come. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She said Robert had always said the land would know who it needed. She looked at Argos. She said maybe the dog knew first. The ridge went fully dark. The stars came all the way out. The mountain settled into the deep quiet it reserved for the end of good days, the kind of quiet that is not empty, but full of everything that has been done and everything that is still to be done, and the particular satisfaction of not being able to tell the difference between the two anymore. Ethan Graves had driven up this mountain in October with everything he owned and a German shepherd riding shotgun, and no plan except that he needed ground under him. He had found ground. He had found a mission. He had found 23 men in a filing box who had come before him and left the same way he was trying to leave, stronger than they came. He had found a room behind a bookshelf that held 30 years of quiet, determined faith that what you build with your own hands and your own conscience can outlast you if you build it right. And he had found something else that he had not been looking for and had not known was missing until it was there. The way you don't know a room is dark until someone walks in with a lamp. The mission continued. The land kept producing. The men kept coming and going, arriving empty and leaving with something in the eyes that had not been there before. The orchard drew toward its first harvest. The creek ran. The shepherd patrolled the perimeter each morning and quartered the meadow each evening and kept his pale gold eyes on the ridge. He stood up from the chair and walked to the rail beside her. Argos raised his head briefly, confirmed the geometry of the arrangement was acceptable, and put his head back down. They stood there for a while without talking, which was not uncomfortable, which was a thing he had not known with very many people in his life. The ability to stand at the edge of a good thing together without needing to add anything to it. He thought about the men who had come up this mountain before him. In Robert's time, the 23 names in the filing boxes, the cards written in careful Navy script. He thought about what it had taken for each of them to make the drive up, to knock on a stranger's door, to accept that they needed a place to land. He thought that was probably the hardest part for men like the ones Robert had helped, and men like the ones Ethan was helping. Now, not the work, not even the quiet. The admission, made to yourself in the cab of a truck on a mountain road, that you needed something you could not provide for yourself. That was the thing that cost. That was the threshold that was harder to cross than any door. He thought about Argos finding the room. 4 hours on the first night. Nose working the baseboard in the firelight, patient and thorough, until he sat down and looked at Ethan. Here, this. Pay attention. He thought that was about right. Some things you find with your mind, some things you find with your instincts, and some things you find because you have a dog with better instincts than you do, who will sit down in front of what matters and wait for you to catch up. Some things are worth holding, some things are worth being held by. If you've ridden this story all the way to the end, you already know the difference. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There's a man and a dog on the screen right now, waiting to take you somewhere you haven't been yet. Click it